This week we're going to talk about flowers, fruits, and seeds, and we're going to start with a discussion around the structure of flowers. So let's look at the different flower parts. First of all, the preliminary function of flowers is to produce seeds, and the seeds, of course, are involved or necessary for reproduction of the plant. The pedicle or pedicel is the flower stalk, and after I go through the various definitions, there'll be a diagram where I show you where these various parts are on the flower. The receptacle is at the end of the pedicel, where the flower attaches to the pedicel. The sepals are leaf-like structures on the end of the receptacle, and if you think about if you've had roses, for example, you'll remember that before the rose opens up, it's usually surrounded by these green leafy-like structures, and then those things peel back as the flower itself comes out. And the purpose of these is to protect the petals of the flower. And then the petals of the flower are the color parts of the flower. And so if we look at this particular diagram, the pedicel is down here, and at the point where the flower attaches to the pedicel, that's called the receptacle. And this flower actually has fairly large sepals. These are the sepals, and then this is the petal. Now inside the flower, there are multiple or several parts. The stamen is the organ that produces the pollen. The pollen is what contains the male sperm cells of the flower. The parts of the stamen include the filament, which is a slender, elongated stalk of the stamen, and on the end of that filament is what is called the anther. And the anther has the pollen on it, and then it produces the pollen. The central structure of the flower, the sort of, quote, female structure of the flower, is called the pistil. And the pistil contains the ovary, which is the base of the pistil, and inside that ovary is the ovule or future seed, which contains the egg cells. The style is the structure that connects the ovary to the top of the pistil, which is called the stigma. The tip of the pistil is called the stigma, and the stigma receives the pollen, and then the pollen migrates down in through the style until it reaches the ovary, and fertilization can occur. So in this diagram, I'm going to point out all these parts I've been talking about. So the stigma is here at the top of the flower, and this is where the pollen is deposited. And then the anther is at the top of the stamen. And the style is this long, slender tube that leads down to the ovary. And the filament is what holds the anther up, and this together is called a stamen. And then the ovary is down here at the base of the pistil, and on this side it's here. And so the stigma over here is here. You can't really see the anther in this flower as well. It's in this area, but you can't see it very well. And then the style is down in this area, and until it reaches the ovary down here. The petals are the colorful parts of the flower that attract the insects. The sepals are these leaf-like structures that protect the flower and the petals. And the receptacle is the base of the top of the pedicel, and it is where the flower attaches to the pedicel. And then lastly, the pedicel is this stalk down here. This is the receptacle down here, and you can't really see the pedicel on this flower, but this is a very large sepal. That's sort of the standard structure. There are some varieties that go with the structure of flowers. A complete flower is a flower that contains all four main flower parts, whereas an incomplete flower only is lacking in one or more of the flower parts. This poinsettia over here has what are called bracts. These red things that people think are flowers, they're not actually flower petals. They're actually called bracts. The poinsettia does not have. This is not actually a flower in the classical sense. And incomplete flowers can be staminate flowers, which means they only contain a stamen, or the male side, or they can be pistillate flowers, which means they only contain the female or ovary side of the flower. So they're incomplete in that they lack, the staminate flowers lack pistils, and the pistillate flowers lack stamen. Now, a plant that produces both staminate and pistillate flowers is called monoecious, whereas a dioecious flower or plant only produces either staminate flowers or pistillate flowers on different plants. This Queen Anne's lace is an example of what's called an inflorescence. An inflorescence is a flowing flower structure with multiple flowers per stem. There are multiple factors that affect flowering. The lengthened day of night is the most important part of the effects on flowering. And what I mean by that is the relationship of how long the days are to how long the dark time or the night is. The longer the daytime compared to the night, the more likely the flower will bloom. And this effect of light and dark cycles is called photoperiodism, and it's the most important aspect that affects flowering. Other things that affect flowering include the external temperature or environmental temperature and the soil fertility. One thing to notice about flowers is an aspect called symmetry. Now, if you remember when we talked about animals, we talked about symmetry. And the definitions of symmetry are the same as they were before. And what I mean by that is radial symmetry is where you can fold the flower in half in multiple different planes and they will be similar halves that you're folding. Whereas bilateral symmetry is where you can fold in one plane. So for example, a flower like this has radial symmetry because you can fold it here, or you could fold it here, or you could fold it here. Similar with this sunflower, or this flower here. Whereas these flowers have bilateral symmetry. You can only fold them in one plane and have two fairly close halves. One thing to notice is the flower parts. For example, how many petals does the flower have? If they have multiples of 3, like this is 6, and this is 3, then the flower is called a monocot. And a monocot means it has one cotyledon in the seed. And we'll talk about this again when we get to seeds. The other type is called a dicot, which has multiples of either 4 or 5 petals per flower. Here's 4 here, here's 5 here. And dicots have 2 cotyledons in their seeds. So let's look for a second at the development of fruits and seeds. The fruit, and I always get a kick out of saying this because some people think it's kind of funny. A fruit is essentially a ripened ovary, which can contain other parts of the flower, but the central aspect of a fruit is the ovary of the flower. The fruit functions as a seed-bearing structure, and the seed-bearing structure is important in seed transportation and seed spread. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther on the stamen to the stigma on the pistil. When pollination occurs, it's followed by fertilization, and fertilization has the same definition in plants. It's the union of egg and sperm. And here are just some various fruit formations. This flower results in this fruit. This flower results in this fruit. And we'll talk about the different kinds of fruits. These two fruits happen. This is a berry, and actually this is a berry as well. When pollination occurs, it can occur with the same plant. The pollen comes from the same plant and the same seed structure or pistil, and that's called self-pollination. If, on the other hand, two different plants are involved, then that's called cross-pollination, and that results in a hybrid, which is genetically a cross between two different plants. Flower produces nectar, and the purpose of the nectar is to bring in the insects which are essential for pollination. Bees are very, very important for the pollination of plants, and a decrease in the bee population can have a severely negative effect on agriculture. Now, it turns out that some people have a problem with pollen, and those people that have an allergic reaction to pollen are said to have hay fever. Hay fever results from the release of histamine when pollen comes in contact with immune cells. And histamine is a chemical that is released and causes the symptoms that people know about, which is primarily itchy, watery eyes, runny nose, and sneezing. And people take drugs to try to block the effect of histamine, and those drugs are called antihistamines. Now, ragweed is selected out because it is probably the most important plant that produces pollen that causes hay fever. More people are sensitive to the pollen of ragweed than any other plant. So here's an example of how pollination occurs. This shows you the steps of pollination. So you start out, pollination is released, or the pollen is released from the anthers, and it collects on the anther, and then a bee comes along, and because it gets on their legs when they're trying to get the nectar, the pollen gets stuck on the stigma, and then subsequently a tube goes from the pollen grain down in through the style to the ovary, and that pollen grain releases a sperm cell. Here's the pollen tube coming down, and it releases a sperm cell into the ovary, and that sperm cell fertilizes these eggs or ovum, and then they begin to divide, and they eventually will form a seed, this is a forming seed over here.